What's going on, guys? TG or ThunderGod here. Today, I'm talking about Sukuna versus each Akatsuki member and seeing how high he can get on the Akatsuki ladder. Spoiler warning. I apologize. I spoiled one person. I'm sorry for spoiling you in the last video, so don't watch past this point if you don't want to be spoiled on JJK. We good? We're good. Doing this as a sequel video to my Gojo vs. the Hokage video. Check that one out after this one, as I'll gloss over some stuff I addressed there. I'll be using the Sukuna that fought Gojo with Maharaga, 10 Shadows, along with his standard techniques, but not the space cutting slash that he used on Gojo. Now, looking at Sukuna from a stat perspective, it isn't that crazy to suggest he'd be able to combat some of the Akatsuki, as there is a bit of a pecking order strength-wise for the Akatsuki. Now, let's look at some of Sukuna's stats. Now, there's a couple different ways we can interpret these characters. For Sukuna's speed, I think Sukuna most consistently scales to the massively hypersonic range and beyond, based on Hikari being able to react to lightning, which does have a range that has been calced to Mach 500 to near 1,000. This even being a jump from the speed feats presented in the series, such as piercing blood creating a sonic boom, or Maki combating opponents with supersonic speed. Obviously, Sukuna would upscale from this, like he scales above pretty much everybody in the verse, but it's not exactly a one-to-one. Now, I also know that there is a JJK like light speed meta off of Kashimo and his electromagnetic waves. I'm going to be honest, I talk about this pretty in-depth in the Gojo video, so I won't spend too much time on it here. I don't necessarily support this interpretation. I think it is a higher end interpretation. When doing these types of videos, I try to look for a bit of consistency with the characters, their scaling, whether that be cross-verse or inverse, as opposed to just one showing that objectively puts them in that tier. Another example would be how Baki displays nowhere near any light speed scaling, yet some people do try to argue light speed Baki. It's just, is it good because it's just so much higher than the ends that are consistently shown? Again, I mentioned this in the Gojo video, so I won't spend too much time on it, but even then, it's actually a lot easier to argue light speed for a lot of Naruto characters compared to JJK characters, as there's multiple Naruto light speed. In terms of speed, Naruto characters would generally come out a bit faster too, because even though I just mentioned like this middle end speed feat for JJK, this is still nothing to the Akatsuki, all of which are able to combat Kakashi, who in a much younger and weaker state can just cut lightning with a Shidori. And this gets more impressive when you consider the fact that if he's seeing the lightning, it's more than likely the return stroke, which is most of the lightning's luminosity in what we see as lightning, which is actually 1/3 the speed of light. So Team Kakashi's already performing like a relativistic feat, and then all of the Akatsuki would just scale to this. And again, this isn't really that crazy since there is lightning speed attacks even in part 1, so this really shouldn't be anything too crazy. And this would just put them generally above even like one of the higher ends of speed for JJK. Even if you want to say like light speed JJK, I could just also just say light speed Naruto and start arguing some of that, as there's many avenues for that as well. So again, it wouldn't really make a difference. The main thing is here is that Sukuna's at a bit of a disadvantage in the speed department. AP isn't as relevant just because he's probably going to need to rely on his hacks more for a lot of these Akatsuki members, but there is some, minor matchups where this actually does play a role. For Sukuna's AP, this is actually where he falters a lot compared to the Akatsuki, because some of his better calcs, whether you look at Sukuna's fire arrow vaporizing a portion of Shibuya, which has been calced to small city level, or the maximum meteor creating an earthquake in Shibuya, which has been calced to small city level plus, these just aren't in the ranges of the Akatsuki, to be honest, who are very used to combating just these continental mountain nuking Bijou. Even off a more conservative interpretation of the Bijou, they would just still be these mountain level monsters. And that's being very generous to JJK. For Sukuna's AP as well, you could also be more generous and maybe look at the domain expansions themselves. Dogon creating an island, or Jogo creating a mountain inside his domain, which again feels like a pretty fair mid-end to just say like Sukuna would upscale from these. But again, right, it doesn't really change the fact that most Akatsuki members would just scale to the Bijou, who would outclass these types of AP feats. There's also Yuki's destroying the world off her black hole feat, and I think a lot of people just throw this around since the attack is planetary. It was going to destroy the world, but I also don't think Sukuna inherently scales above it, just like he doesn't inherently scale above every curse technique such as Limitless, along with this technique being more of an outlier, being more so brought about by Yuki's death and like moving beyond her own limits. It's more of like a higher end that JJK really shouldn't scale to, or at least Sukuna shouldn't, with like his punches or like his attacks. If you want more on that, again, Gojo video, more in depth. There is more to this, but again, I talk about this in the Gojo video. I don't want to spend too much time on the stats, as I want to talk about this more and more as it becomes relevant in the discussion. So I'm going to put a quick, pin in the stat stuff. and we'll talk about it more as it becomes relevant in the micro discussion. For Sukuna's abilities, we obviously have Dismantle, where he's able to form and create invisible slashes. Cleave, an ability where he can essentially adjust his slashes depending on the opponent's durability, and, you know, increase the output to match it to take them down in one foul swoop. He also has his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, a barrage of slash attacks made up of Dismantle and or Cleave. The whole verse equalization wouldn't really matter for this shrine since curse energy is not required for a target since this is a barrierless domain, but still, you know, just to note it. He has Megami's 10 Shadows technique, and the big one, Maharaga, which has the ability to adapt to any and all phenomena. Now, the thing about Maharaga is that he can't actually be one-shot if the attack is just too strong from an AP perspective. Maharaga's adaptation mainly comes about from being against the opponent relative to him or who are just unable to one-shot him. Pretty self-explanatory stuff, as this is how it works even in JJK's own verse. And he has the reverse curse technique, which allows him to regenerate limbs as long as his head is intact or just heal from damage. So it becomes apparent that unless you're going with the absolute peak interpretation of JJK, and even then it could be debated, Sukuna's at a bit of a speed and power disadvantage, which will just really leave it up to his hacks to really carry him to victory in some of these matchups. But without further ado, we can actually get into the discussion. And listen, if you guys enjoyed anything you heard, consider subscribing or liking the video, or both. Anyway, let's go on. Now, starting off, we have Hidan. Now, the interesting about Hidan is that pretty basic standard ability, you know, obviously the weak link in the Akatsuki, but he obviously has his Scythe and his Ritual, which if he gets a bit of Sukuna's blood, pretty much allows him to inflict any damage that he takes back on Sukuna. Now, the very interesting thing here is that if Hidan gets any of Sukuna's blood, it kind of doesn't matter since Sukuna can just literally regenerate any part of his body unless Hidan just like hits his brainstem. Anything else, Sukuna can just regen. I mean, he literally existed inside of Yuji's body without a heart. You know what I'm saying? Hidan stabbing his own chest isn't really going to do that much when like Sukuna did the same thing, which really means that Hidan is more so forced to go for like a decapitation route for a W, which also pretty much means that Sukuna can just use any ability to kind of take on Hidan. Now, probably the most effective one, which we're going to hear a lot today, is his domain expansion, which he would use to overwhelm Hidan and keep him at a distance. Maharaga isn't that relevant in this discussion since there's not really any abilities for him to adapt to here. The 10 Shadows aren't also as relevant, and the fact that Hidan is the weakest of the Akatsuki, you could also just imply would also lead him to be closer in the stat department to Sukuna than the rest, as even his showings against Kakashi, in my opinion, are somewhat debatable just due to the way Hidan is more so just attacking offensively against Kakashi and not really just defending against Kakashi, which kind of leads to the idea Kakashi probably just scales above Hidan objectively, with Kakashi taking on the likes of Kakuzu, who's definitely the stronger of the immortal duo. And if you really wanted to be there, you could just say Maharaga would just adapt to Hidan's heavy hitting slashes. If they really do hit that hard, we really don't have a measure for Hidan and how hard he really hits in the AP department, just due to the fact that his whole engagement off the Two Tails is off screen, and it's more so implied that him and Kakuzu just timed out the Two Tails timer, as opposed to just Hidan stabbing the foot of the Two Tails and drawing blood from Yugito there, which if you do imply would just like completely mitigate any and all win conditions for Hidan. So it just seems that like unless you say Hidan is just a straight up blitz tier above Sukuna, which maybe you infer off the scaling, I think there is wiggle room there, just again just due to where Hidan is kind of located on the hierarchy. Decapitation might not be in the cards, and even then in character it's not like Hidan goes for the head anyways. He's Thor from Infinity War. He needs to learn from his mistakes. For this video, I'll also be doing verse equalization. That basically means that everyone's abilities are going to be working on everyone, just for the sake of making stuff easier to talk about, and I don't have to go through like all this like hoops to just explain stuff. Now, this is a little difficult, especially with how JJK is framed with its series. Like, let me give you an example, right? You can look at the Tranquil Deer, which due to it using like positive cursed energy, it is able to just negate normal cursed energy, as displayed in Sukuna's fight with Yorozu. Does this mean that like it's just gonna negate normal, like how chakra works? You know what I mean? Like it's kind of funny to think about. So I have to make some minor concessions here and just like say everything kind of works for the sake of making this video actually doable. So Hidan probably loses just because Sukuna can really just mitigate his one win con and shouldn't be that far behind in terms of stats, at least in comparison to Hidan. Next up, we have Kakuzu. Now, Kakuzu is a lot more interesting because there's a lot more discussion to be had with their abilities. For example, you know, Sukuna has the 10 Shadows and Maharaga, Kakuzu can separate his hearts from himself, which kind of leads for both these opponents to kind of summon more like, groups or extensions of their own techniques to fight with them. Now, right off the bat, Diamond Morph is going to be the biggest issue for Sukuna to just get through with Dismantle, as Kakuzu is just way too durable. This is being amplified by the fact that Diamond Morph's upper limits really just aren't known, and you can make some pretty insane implications, especially if you want to look at like the crater and the hole left by Yugito to maybe say like a tail beast bomb was shot. So you can really make some crazy assertions for Diamond Morph in the upper limits, but you know, more conservatively, I mean, he's just like tanking paper bombs to his face and doesn't really do anything. And it would be interesting because then, you know, Sukuna would use Dismantle. It wouldn't cut through Diamond Morph. And then he would use Cleave to adjust to Kakuzu's heightened durability, which becomes the question, can Sukuna actually cleave that high of an opponent in terms of durability? It doesn't seem likely. Honestly, it's a little weird because you kind of have to argue the higher limits of Diamond Morph and the higher limits of Cleave. I'd probably lean on the side that it wouldn't just straight up bypass Diamond Morph. Now, obviously, this is a double-edged since if Kakuzu's just, you know, Diamond Morphing his whole body, he can't move. So he kind of has to do it partially. This, along with the fact that it seems that Sukuna needs to make physical contact to use Cleave. You see this when he's fighting Maki and Yuji. When he like touches the ground and uses like the spider web Cleave. Or when he does it against Maharaga, he like puts his hand on his forearm, which would also be pretty disastrous because he would actually have to just get straight up close to Kakuzu, which that's where Kakuzu wants to be. He wants to use Diamond Morph on his arm and just box. I mean, just look at the anime version of Kakashi versus Kakuzu. It's straight up hands. And the fact that Kakuzu is actually able to overwhelm or deal with someone with enhanced precog or a form of threat perception in the form of Kakashi's Sharingan also does bolster his fact that Sukuna would have a difficult time here. Kakuzu might even fuck around and Diamond Morph in his domain. He's going to be looking like Broly on a Kamehameha, just standing there menacingly. Like it's that real. You could actually make that argument for Diamond Morph because of how like the upper limits are just kind of, it could be said to be a little crazier. The hearts themselves are also just going to be hitting really hard, like the lightning heart just hits as hard as Raikiri. So that hitting Sukuna would just be the equivalent of Kakashi just grabbing a Raikiri and putting it through his chest. You also have some interesting like micro discussions. Like what if Kakuzu uses like Searing Migraine and like amplifies it with like the Wind Heart, and Sukuna's like, let's do a firepower battle and just use the arrow. How does that go? Because in Naruto, it's kind of like when you have two techniques equally matched like that, like for example, the Sasuke versus Itachi like fireball clash, the winner is the one who's outputting more chakra into the technique, which is going to make it larger and, you know, more potent. So in that situation, it's also a little weird because you'd have to quantify like the amount of cursed energy Sukuna has versus like Kakuzu's own chakra pool. And the thing about like Kakuzu is that this ninjutsu is going to be hitting so hard that Maharaga is not really going to have the opportunity to adapt, since there's going to be 4 different elemental attacks being put at play. So it's not as if he's going to be able to get familiar with any of them. It's just going to be a really bad time, to the point Sukuna might just get overwhelmed by these like enhanced chakra level attacks. This is even talking about if Kakuzu actually does decide to fuse with his heart and take a more offensive form with it. Unironically, I think a funny scenario is if Kakuzu actually does try to steal Sukuna's heart, and then because he stole Sukuna's heart, kind of like one of Sukuna's fingers, Sukuna like takes over Kakuzu or something like that. Like he tries to do that. I don't know. It's kind of funny to think about. One of the better ways for Sukuna would just really try and be and open that malevolent shrine and just take down all of the hearts while leaving Kakuzu himself, even if he uses Diamond Morph like stationary. As the hearts aren't especially known for their durability, it's kind of weird. They don't really have like great durability feats, but then there's also no anti-feats. You know, they get one-shotted by a ninja tool by Tenten in the war, but it's a cracked ninja tool. So maybe they're garbage, you know. So if he can do that and actually just expand his barrier range to hit all of the hearts with the guaranteed effect of his Malevolent Shrine, that actually may be a win condition. But again, right, it doesn't really change the fact that Kakuzu's Earth Heart is just going to be the biggest problem. Unless you want to maybe argue like Maharaga eventually adapts to Diamond Morph. That's probably like one of the only ways I could really see Sukuna getting around it, because it just causes so much issues for him. The 10 Shadows technique, it's a very useful technique within JJK, but I can't necessarily see any of the summons really making that much of a difference here. Like, what's Sukuna going to do with them? Is he going to drop the Max Elephant on Kakuzu, who can just like catch the paw of the Two Tails? No, man, he's just gonna like punch that thing right back up. So the biggest thing here is that Maharaga would definitely need to be in play for a while for Sukuna to gain momentum, and he would kind of have to be generous in like taking down Kakuzu's hearts. Otherwise, he's just gonna get hit with some insanely high AP elemental combined jutsu that's just gonna be too difficult for him to really deal with, unless you argue maybe he regens it or is able to evade it, depending on your interpretation of some of the speed scaling. I'll say this though, I think Maharaga adaptation is probably the least likely here, just due to how there's a lot of different techniques being fired off, whereas Maharaga's adaptation is a lot better when it's being gradually used against the same technique. And there's a good example of this I'll talk about later on in the video. Next up we have Sasori. Now Sasori is especially interesting because his main attribute is his unbeatable poison causing near instant paralysis. This same poison impressing the shit out of Chiyo, who not only is a poison expert and had like a pseudo poison war with Tsunade of all people, but also did have like knowledge of Hanzo and did fight against him or on the same field of battle with him consistently, and was exposed to like his paralysis poison. So Sasori's poison is no joke. What's interesting is there's actually a case to be made that Sukuna would be immune to all poisons and all toxins. Looking at the statement that because Yuji is Sukuna's vessel, who is the king of all lethal poisons, Yuji is immune to all toxins. Now, this actually does differ a bit from translation to translation. With the main translation difference, or like mistrans, being that he is the king of poisons, Yuji being immune to poison is usually the same across all the translations. So the core element does stay the same here, which is why we can kind of use this. This essentially makes it that Sasori's poison could be a debatable topic. You kind of have to assume that, okay, all like poisons or just poison immunity extends to like every type of poison, which generally there are different kinds, so I just don't want to make a blanket statement. I just think it is kind of an interesting note that this is a possibility for Sukuna. Aside from that though, I will say the Iron Sand is just extremely detrimental to Sukuna with the third Kazekage puppet. I mean, this thing is going to be ridiculous. Not only can Sasori just amplify its speed with like focused condensed attacks while using the polarity of the Iron Sand, which again would just like put it another speed tier above a potential speed gap between him and Sukuna, but it'll just completely shred through Maharaga as well. The only way this doesn't work is if Sasori just doesn't like one-shot Maharaga with like a large-scale sand attack, and then he uses like some smaller variant that allows Maharaga to heal and just come back and start adapting to the Iron Sand attacks themselves. But even then, right, like that's ignoring the poison point I made previously. This also isn't talking about the third Kazekage puppet itself. Now, I will say the third Kazekage puppet isn't that durable. I mean, the puppets generally in the show aren't. The more durable puppets are like the one Sasori is inhabiting with his host body. So there actually is a good case that Sukuna could actually just body the third Kazekage puppet with Dismantle or Cleave. Again, if he wants to adjust the durability, but it really shouldn't be that big of an issue for him. There's also a question of Maharaga, right? Because like, since Maharaga can adapt to any and all phenomena, would he just like, if he's hit by, you know, the Iron Sand, right? Which each like sand grain is coated in poison, and he's like paralyzed, would he eventually just adapt to the poison to the point that it would just no longer have an effect? I feel like that's a fair interpretation. The flip side to that though is that Sasori can just use like Iron Sand World Order and just end the fight if he sees like, oh my god, my poison's not working, I need to expend some chakra here, kind of similar to the Sakura and Chiyo encounter, and just start dicing up Maharaga that way. Sasori's Iron Sand should just have no issues as well, since it just scales above like the likes of Rasa and Gaara throughout the series with their sand densities. Iron Sand being at the pinnacle of all of these and what actually made the third Kazekage the strongest. The main issue, honestly speaking, is that Sasori's host body, even though it does have a like ample amount of durability, for example, like Sakura just punches it in the face, a domain expansion would probably be pretty disastrous for Sasori. Just simply, he may not have the durability to actually just tank those slashes, and it just really takes like one graze on his core to permanently put him down. So it would be pretty difficult for him in that regard. There's also the idea that like, okay, maybe even Sukuna could just use his like Cleave or Dismantle to actually cut the chakra threads themselves. This is something that Naruto characters also do in verse, which could add some more interesting layers. Like if he like puts Sasori in the domain, does the act of just cutting Sasori inherently cut the chakra threads too? I don't know. I think it's an interesting point. I will say though, I am being a little more generous with the poison interpretation for the Sukuna side, but I definitely think like the best win con in the Sukuna side is the just domain expansion. Fire Arrow could be good in that case of Sasori, but again, you could also argue his actual body itself, which does have those 3 scrolls on his back. In the manga, it's fire, and the anime also like adds to it by adding high pressurized water. So there is something that can be done, but at the end of the day, it does kind of depend on your interpretation of a couple things. Realistically, Sasori could just paralyze Sukuna and Mahoraga and just end this fight instantly with Iron Sand if he really chooses to. Not even discussing any speed enhancements with the Iron Sand or Sasori himself with the 100 puppets, which I'm going to be honest, I actually think is like a downgrade, even though Sasori's like human body is stronger than the third Kazekage puppet, and he implies as such. If he does the 100 puppets, they are just prime fodder for a domain expansion. Like a large-scale Malevolent Shrine is cooking this battlefield. So kind of an interesting discussion. You can also talk about some cool stuff. Maybe, you know, Sukuna just goes into the shadow, kind of like Megami does, or how he does in his fight with Gojo to avoid some of these attacks. But realistically, again, kind of goes back to some speed scaling. So, but Sasori should have a pretty solid chance of taking it. Just does kind of depend on your interpretation of a couple things. Next up, we have Deidara. Now, Deidara is very interesting because this is probably one of the only situations to where if you wanted to argue like Mahoraga adaptation, I think this is probably the best ones because that's always prevalent, right? Just due to how like it functions. It's just kind of like how strong are the attacks like in comparison. But this is one of those situations where depending how Deidara starts the fight, like with the C1 explosive, you could actually make a case Mahoraga might be able to build up some adaptation. But the flip side is if Deidara like flies up and just drops a C3 bomb, both Sukuna and Mahoraga are dead. Like there's no question for like the village wiping, you know, nuke. There's no nothing there. Something interesting in this situation too, I want to note is that Sukuna can engage in aerial combat by kicking the air like Might Guy does, which is really cool. So he may actually just be able to like approach Deidara in the air. But I'll say this, there's no way he's as fast as Deidara in the air because Deidara in the air is an animal. He's like comparable to like a faster than Prime Onoki. And if you actually look at the fight between Sasuke and Deidara, aside from the maneuver where Sasuke actually clips the C2 dragon, which is probably slower than some of Deidara's smaller summons, which is what he uses, in the air Deidara is never getting tagged. Like even when Sasuke in Curse Mark stage 2 like tags him, it's just straight up a clone. Like he sees through the genjutsu and everything. So Deidara in the air is really difficult to take on. The Gar example also cites this where he literally had unlimited reserves of sand along with the special sand in his gourd that's actually faster, and it was still very difficult for him to actually catch and like restrain Deidara. Sukuna's best chance, honestly speaking, is just domain off rip at the start of the fight and just catch Deidara that way. Because once Deidara starts getting distance and starts launching these long-range explosives, it's just going to be too much unless, like, again, Sukuna just expands his domain range that far. Deidara's explosives also would just be insanely detrimental to Sukuna. Able to literally put the Three Tails on its back with a lower variant of it. So imagine like a higher C3 variant. It would just be, especially since the Tail Beasts do scale relative to one another, at least in their physicality and attacks. This is like a weird subtopic, but the Tail Beasts are comparable to one another. The whole like more tails equals more chakra is more so relevant when they're going into those like you know, Bijou Bomb type clashes. Otherwise, all the tail beasts are able to like brawl with one another and damage the A-tails, which I think does put into perspective the firepower that Deidara is really letting off here. Which again, unless you argue like Deidara does like what he does against Sasuke and just like starts with C1 and jumps to C2. If he doesn't do any of that, or if Sukuna just doesn't domain off rip or make a domain big enough, Deidara is just going to nuke the area. And again, there's no real way to argue that Deidara is anywhere near the speed of Sukuna in the air. Deidara should be way faster. And if you want that evidence, look at how he fights versus Sasuke. Sasuke actually does catch Deidara by surprise with this speed. It actually does tag Deidara, with Deidara more so escaping in the explosion. Yet when he's aerial, his missiles are what is extremely threatening to Sasuke. And again, we know how fast he is in the air. So this is one of those situations where it kind of does depend on how they fight, but it's a lot easier for you to just say like Deidara drops like an explosive that kind of clips both characters, since he would just destroy the entirety of Sukuna, really making it so RCT doesn't really have that much of an effect here. It's kind of tougher because when you get to these higher matchups, it really just kind of turns into like a domain or nothing type situation for Sukuna, just because these Akatsuki members just start to like, once they start unleashing what they have, you could almost be considered an instant W just due to their abilities being that strong. But yeah, Malevolent Shrine is actually threatening to most of the Akatsuki. It actually is pretty detrimental. A lot of Akatsuki members just wouldn't have an answer for it. It just kind of goes back to that stat point I mentioned earlier. There really is just nothing in this micro situation to stop Deidara from just going higher, or potentially even outside Sukuna's max domain range, or like how far he could extend his domain, where he just drops a bomb that is just way too strong for either Sukuna to tank or for Mahoraga to adapt to, and it would get one shot. Next up, we have Kisame. Now, Kisame is very interesting because this is where like that verse equalization kind of comes into play a bit more, because there's a lot of interesting like micro discussions with Kisame, like him, you know, if you equate cursed energy and chakra, what could he absorb? You know what I'm saying? Like obviously Sukuna's cursed energy itself would be open season for him, but it's not like he's really going to be able to absorb the chakra from any dismantle attacks. It's also kind of interesting because you could argue maybe he absorbs cursed energy from Maharaga. It's a little interesting since the curse is just a manifestation of cursed energy. So like, would Kisame just drain Maharaga to absolute zero? Like, what's the deal with that? I mean, it kind of gets into like the 10 shadows technique and how that fundamentally operates. It's also interesting to think about how Maharaga would just adapt to energy absorption as well, if it even can. I mean, a way I would look at it is that Maharaga emits positive energy, which was lethal to curses, which Sukuna notes. And when Sukuna actually does survive a blow, Maharaga's wheel like turns and it channels cursed energy instead, which does allow it to counter Sukuna's technique. So maybe it would change its energy to something that Kisame just wouldn't be able to absorb. I think it's interesting discussion, like how that would fundamentally operate. But aside from, I mean, that, like, Kisame just like nukes the area in water and forces Sukuna like underwater along with Maharaga, where he would just have free domain. And we know in character that Kisame just nukes the battlefield with water anyway. And I mean, listen, if he fused with Samehada, you know, Sukuna himself is just clipped. Like, there's no real way to argue Sukuna's going to be able to just like out-reserve fuse Samehada. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'll say this too. This is where like the speed gaps start getting a little too, you know, a lot, you know, even though like you could be generous to JJK, this is where it just becomes like, okay, yeah, like it's, you know, Kisame scaling to like base to version 1 Killer B. Killer B scales to the Raikage. These are higher speed characters within the series who would just upscale from an already like advantageous stat position. So again, right, like Kisame would just fall into this and just kind of like absorb all of Sukuna's energy at that point, maybe even before he even gets the chance to summon Maharaga. The 10 Shadows technique also probably wouldn't aid him, and again it goes back to like the point we were making before, but Kisame would just absorb their cursed energy as well, and it would just be fuel for him to just heal from whatever Sukuna throws at him. Again, pretty much at this point, Sukuna's best win condition is just Malevolent Shrine and like trying to behead Kisame at that point. But other than that, like Kisame would just be able to regen everything via like Samehada and just continually absorb Sukuna until he like pulls off that W. The fact that this dude could change his landscape, create water clones, and just force the fight underwater too, makes it that Sukuna's going to be in a pretty disadvantageous situation as well. This is not going to be like when Toji's in Dagon's domain. No. Like Kisame's like 10 times crazier in the water. 1,000 Shark Jutsu, Super Water Shark Bomb, all this insane stuff, and not even talking about if him fusing with Samehada. It would just be way too much for Sukuna to deal with. So Kisame should take a pretty confident dub. Again, unless Daddy Maharaga comes in and just, you know, lays down the business. And even then, that's a little funky. Like, you might be able to unironically say Kisame's water style might one-shot Maharaga too at some points. Or just shred him in half with Samehada. But again, that's where the regen comes in. So, yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record on this point. Next up, we have Itachi. Now, this is where the Akatsuki just straight up... I'll be honest, right? The top 3 of the Akatsuki do actually just cliff JJK entirely, because even if I gave you the most generous like interpretation for JJK being light speed, it wouldn't matter because the top 3 of the Akatsuki are generally light speed, like indisputably. Itachi, we do know, like suffering from disease and like having blindness, could react to Kirin, which is stated to be light speed. No, Kirin is not just lightning speed, it just utilizes natural lightning, which basically means any arguments where you could kind of like pussyfoot and just jump on one side or the other and be like, maybe you could be generous to no, it's not here. It's over. It's done. Like, these are the characters that are just like not having it at all. Now, I'm gonna be brutally honest, Genjutsu just like annihilates. Like, there's no real discussion to be had. Like, there is nothing to suggest Sukuna would be able to do anything against Genjutsu. Tsukiyomi would just be a GG. Itachi can't kill him that way. Kakashi also notes it, like he could have killed me if he wanted to. An interesting idea, though, is that Sukuna could shift the damage from Tsukiyomi or Genjutsu to Megami's soul in a similar way that he shifted the burden of Maharaga's adaptation. But this doesn't really work because Sukuna was 0.01 seconds too slow, which resulted in him getting the mental damage from Gojo's domain. And we all know that one novel statement where Itachi puts his girlfriend in a Genjutsu where she spends 1/1000th of a second like living out her entire life, meaning that Itachi could just like do whatever damage he wants to in that time frame and then just run up and Totsuka Blade if you really want to take it there. There's no real discussion to be had, no real argument to be made. There's no like no, this is just instant hacks beatdown. Itachi's just gonna come in. There's no like Like me being generous to Sukuna and some of these there's none of that here. I can't even do it for you. I can't lie no more, man. Sorry about that. Got a bit emotional. Point is that, yeah, this isn't really gonna happen. Sukuna does get taken down via Genjutsu. Even like in the own verse where like counters to Genjutsu exist, Tsukuyomi's just godly. So let's stop right there. So yeah, Tsukuyomi is a pretty big GG here. And if you want to be grimy, just Totsuka Blade GG as well. Like there's no further discussion that needs to be had. Next up we have Konan. Konan's interesting because you could actually make a case that she herself would be immune to Sukuna, not only his cleave and dismantle, but his domain attacks, just due to the way how she has like a pseudo Kamui-like ability to fizzle through attacks like fire style and whatnot. Like, just cutting up the paper wouldn't really do too much to harm her. You know what I'm saying? It really wouldn't be too much. So, that's kind of an interesting note. She's almost immune to what he could do. Even the fire arrow. Like, she literally gets hit with fire style and she's chilling. And we do know that, like, Konan, if she's, like, resolving herself to just, like, nuke herself and the opponent, can damage somebody who's just eating Rasengans to the back, like Obito blowing his arm off. So, if you argue that, there's a case to be made that she could actually just, like, one-shot Sukuna with her paper bombs. Not even gonna lie. I'm being 100. Like, there is a very valid chance that could happen because she should be immune to everything. Maharaga's more interesting because there is actually a good chance that he could adapt to her paper and actually just hit the real her. Now, there's also the thing, right? Like, if she's doing this paper bomb strategy, Maharaga's also just getting one shot as well. Like, you know what I mean? So, I don't necessarily see a situation where, like, he would survive as well. But, you know, again, this kind of, like, arguing Konan's willing to do this, which she only really does against Obito. But I'm going to say she does. The Ten Shadows technique really doesn't do too much here. Like, none of the shadows really are going to just offer something to hit her. Like, what was Max Elephant just going to, like, wet her? It's, like, showing that her paper is actually waterproof. Like, she coats it in oil. So, it's just, like, all these micro things, like, she has counters for. So, it just seems likely that Sukuna would not have a way to damage her unless you argue, like, inside the domain. She wouldn't be able to activate, like, the dance of the Shikigami, which, you know, is weird to suggest. It'd be more so that domain would activate and she would just get, like, shred up and then just reassemble herself with the remaining paper. Or just fly outside, like, Sukuna's range with, like, all the paper and stuff like that. So Konan actually has a pretty good chance either. It's really weird to say. And again, she ironically has the AP to do it. Like, I'm not even joking. She's actually a lot harder to hit than most of the Akatsuki, just due to the elusive nature of her arsenal. So Konan would actually be pretty disastrous for Sukuna as well. Next up, we have Pain, and Pain's very similar. There's not too much like Sukuna's really gonna be able to do. Not only are the paths of Pain notoriously durable, so it's actually questionable if he'd actually be able to just cleave right through them or just take them down with basic dismantle. But Bansho Tenin into Rinnegan Rod is just so, like, it's insane GG, because then Nagato's just gonna pour his chakra through the Rinnegan Rod and paralyze Sukuna. There really wouldn't be any opportunity for him there. This is not talking about how, like, for example, the animal path could summon, like, the dog that he puts the jutsu on. The same dog that, if you want to argue, like, Sukuna tries to, like, open a domain on, like, some of these, like, you know, creatures or just all of the paths of pain. The same dog that was reacting to a technique comparable to infinite attacks, Kakashi with the Sharingan making this comparison? Yeah, no. Like, so that's already one creature that Sukuna already just can't take down even with his domain. So imagine what all 6 paths of pain are going to do. And again, like, Fire Arrow, all of this, just Shinra Tensei, basically limitless at this point, the way it can just repel ninjutsu, taijutsu. Sukuna's just going to get blatantly overwhelmed by pain at this point. And the fact that Nagato can just inject his chakra would just be pretty disastrous for Sukuna at this point. This isn't even talking about possible soul snatch via the human path. Preta path just absorbing all of Sukuna's energy. There just is too much going on to where, like, Maharaga also just, like, has all these distinct abilities where he's not going to be able to, like, adapt at all. Like, there's not too much to be said. Sukuna's going to get overwhelmed pretty quickly by all of this. Even a domain expansion wouldn't really matter because on top of the speed disparity, the paths of pain are notoriously durable. So unless you argue like Sukuna's AP is that high with domain expansion, they actually just might survive. Like, these paths of pain, notoriously known for just tanking Rasengans, Raikiri. And let me just see one comment. One comment talking about Konohamaru taking down the Naraka path. I'll slap the shit out of you. Stop it. I'm sorry. That was mean. I didn't mean any of that. I'm sorry, man. But yeah, moral of the story is there isn't too much for Sukuna to really do here. Next up, we have Obito. And, I mean, it's the same thing I argued before, but none of Sukuna's abilities work. Like, none of them at all. Like, domain expansion, it's just nothing. And the reason they don't work is that even though domain expansions are like, they are sure like hit fire guarantee, any part that they target are just gonna be in a different time space. So it's not like Sukuna's gonna be hitting somebody who's in a completely different time space. And honestly speaking, like, Obito can just BFR him. Like, just throw him in the Kamui dimension, wipe his hands, be done with it. Or if he really doesn't want to deal anything, again, he could just use Genjutsu. Like the same Genjutsu that can manipulate a perfect Jinchuriki or control the Nine Tails, he could also go down this avenue. It would be kind of cool to think about how Mahoraga would interact with Kamui. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know how that would possibly go. Like, maybe the shadow just follows Obito into the Kamui dimension or something. I don't know, man. It's like the Mahoraga is such a new... I feel like I'm low-key standing Mahoraga in this video over Sukuna himself. I don't know. Mahoraga is cool, man. Let me know how you think down below Mahoraga could potentially adapt to some of these Akatsuki members. I'm really interested to hear your guys' thoughts. But moral of the story is, yeah, like, you know, Obito just really isn't going to have any issues with Sukuna at this point. That's the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you did. Let me know your thoughts down below. You know, if you want to see more JJK, or if you guys have any critique, any JJK stuff, please let me know. Again, go check out the Gojo video if you're interested on my opinion on that. I'll link that down below. But, you know, still getting into the verse, so if you guys want to, like, give me any, you know, throw any takes at me, please do. Hopefully you guys enjoy a bit of a fun discussion. Check out the Gojo vid. I feel like I'm repeating myself. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.